Now for tonight's author feature, Sarah Menkedick's debut essay collection, Homing Instincts, was longlisted for the Penn Diamonstein Spielvogel Award for the Art of the Essay. Her writing has appeared in Harper's Magazine, Pacific Standard, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, the Guardian, the Kenyon Review, the Paris Review Daily, BuzzFeed, and Long Reads. She holds an MFA in nonfiction from the University of Pittsburgh, where she taught nonfiction writing. Still, I believe, teaches a few classes, and she lives in Pittsburgh with her family. Sarah, Gramercy Books is so thrilled for you to join us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
And in conversation with Sarah is Dr. Janette McDonald. Janette is a psychology expert and a member of the faculty at Capital University. She studies the development of human consciousness and self-awareness as a preface to or a part of philosophy. Janette, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Linda. It's always a pleasure to be here. Look forward to our conversation with Sarah.
And thanks to all of you for joining us this evening. And now a warm welcome to Sarah Menkedick in conversation with Janette McDonald.
Well, Sarah, you have written quite a monumental undertaking book. And when I was getting ready to prepare to interview tonight, I was struck by the kind of research you did, the narrative research, the historical research, what I would call the archival research. And you also expose generational flaws, I think, in the medical treatment, especially of women of color. And your work seems to accentuate the persistent social attitudes and misunderstanding or lack of understanding of mental illness, specifically postpartum depression. When I shared with a friend that I would be reading your book, she asked me, well, what's the book about? And I said, well, it's about a lot. And I found myself struggling to provide a clear and precise answer. So this is what I said. I said, it's about so much. It's about mental illness, it's about women and motherhood, it's about injustice in our medical system, it's about racial injustice, it's about a contemporary view of becoming a mother and entering motherhood. And it reads like a memoir, but it also has a real scholarly flair to it. So with that, let me ask my first question. In chapter 3, which you title Risk Society, you describe how the meaning of the word risk has changed throughout history and how it was first used to describe the probability of when something would occur, when an event would occur. And the positives and the negatives would be weighed toward an outcome. And I found that in reading your book, the word risk, was wrapped in negativity and fear and unwanted danger. So from your personal examples, your own examples, and of the women that you write about, I was wondering what you would think would be some of the risks that were indeed worth taking, and what were some of the risks that you would deem not worth taking?
Right. Well, that's an excellent question. And first of all, thank you so much for that beautiful summary of the book, because I wish I would have had that back in the day when I was pitching it, because I kept trying to explain what it was. And it was just this big, a mass of all these different things coming together. So it is a hard one to summarize. And that was beautiful. Thank you. So to go to your question about risk, when you mean the risks that were worth taking for me personally in my experience versus the ones that weren't worth taking. So I think, the risks worth taking were all the ones that I took. And I say that because, probably because I'm okay and my daughter's okay. And had that turned out differently, I might say that differently. But I think, the risks that I took were the ways that I asserted myself as a mother and my own values and my own priorities. And I think, one of the main points of that chapter is that in the domain of parenting and in the domain of pregnancy, there is so little room for mothers to be themselves, right? We live by this extremely rigid and strict set of regulations that are ironically always shifting, right? One month it's don't let your baby eat eggs. They give them allergies. And the next month it's, oh, definitely introduce eggs to your baby before this age, right? All the time. But we're expected, all of us, to sort of adhere to these very loose guidelines or this expert advice all the time. So in this domain of our lives, there's really not much room at all for individuality, even as each woman is sort of on her own journey as a mother. So I think for me, the risks that I took, like, for example, I took my newborn to Massachusetts on a road trip. And, at first it was so traumatic. The baby was crying the whole time. I was crying. We thought, this isn't worth it. We turned around actually, and we stopped at a hotel. And we thought we were just going to turn back. We stopped at the hotel and we had a beer. And I was like, no, we got to keep going. Like, we've got to do this, and the next day we just plowed through and the baby cried, but we did it. And I think doing that, and then we went and we stayed with my best friend and we hiked and my friend, when she had a newborn years later, was like, wow, I didn't realize how insane that was, that you did that. But I think I needed to do that for myself and my identity as a traveler and as a mother. And then I took my baby to Mexico when she was 3 months old. My husband is Mexican. He's from Oaxaca, and we lived there for about 5 years together. So Oaxaca is a really big part of who we are. And some people might say, oh my gosh, some people don't even want to go to Mexico as adults, right? Obviously, it's very safe there. It's beautiful. It's a wonderful city. But we took our very young daughter there, and we stayed there for a couple of months. And while certainly I had my anxieties while I was there, it was incredibly powerful to be able to introduce her to that world and to her family. And it also was a reminder to me that so many of the things that we think are essential as parents here, my husband never had growing up, and many people there don't have. And it just sort of stripped all of that away. So I think, to answer your question, I think a lot of the risks that I didn't take were actually not our regrets that I have now, were things that, probably would have been okay. And I just constantly erred on the safe side. And I certainly in my parenting have erred much more on the risk aversion side than on the risk taking side. And that is one of my regrets from early childhood with my daughter.
Well, and as somewhat of a follow-up to that, you say that anthropologist Mary Douglas states that to understand our contemporary view of risk, we need to replace the word risk with sin. That I was very struck by that concept. So what an interesting suggestion to do that. Could you say a little bit more about how this may or may not have fit with some of your own experiences or the women that you interviewed?
Yes, definitely. So that's a great quote to pull out, because I think when we talk about risk in this context, it's very easy to sort of have this scientific justification for all these prohibitions and rituals that we may do as mothers or have as mothers, right? So, okay, well, I'm not going to eat turkey. I'm not going to drink any caffeine. I'm not going to do, I'm sure any woman who's become a mother can list 15 of those right off the bat, right? Because, the evidence says this and this and this and this. And so I think it has this mantle of like, this is just the scientific way to do things, even when actually, when you dig into it, the risks of many of those things are infinitesimal or are only in certain contexts and have often been taken out of context and whatnot. But when you talk about it in terms of sin, I think there's an understanding that we still have this very antiquated way of thinking about pregnancy and of punishing women who, stray from, like I said, these sort of very rigid guidelines, or stray from the prescribed advice, or insist on doing things their own way. And so, one of the fascinating things that I found was that a teratogen, which is like a toxin to the baby in the womb, so it's any sort of substance or chemical or whatnot, it can be natural or chemical, that's harmful to a baby in the womb, is a teratogen. And the origin of that is actually Greek, and it means, and I'm paraphrasing a bit here because I don't remember the exact term, but basically something like monster making, like monster producing. So this notion that you're going to produce a monster baby, right? So this very like mythological religious weight to things, that if you, the mother, don't sort of subscribe to the most extreme model of purity, almost this religious model of purity, of abolishing anything at all that could potentially cause harm, even if the risk is almost non-existent, then you're sort of you're almost making this sinful transgression, right? Which is why it is so hard for women, and particularly pregnant women, to push back against that and say, you know what, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to have my cup of coffee in the morning because actually the studies show this, and this is essential to my well-being, right? Because it's very much taken on a sort of other character beyond just the purely scientific. So that makes it particularly, that also makes it very difficult to recognize anxiety as anxiety, right? Because, it takes on these dimensions of like, how much sacrifice are you willing to put in for your baby? So when we talk about like this line that women are continually fed when they're pregnant, or even when their children are little, why risk it, right? That makes sense the first time that you hear it. Why, why have the glass of wine? Why have the sandwich from Subway, right? Why have the iced tea? Or why one woman said, why change a light bulb, right? But when you start repeating it over and over and over, it starts to become a little insane, right? Because if we live our lives by that logic of why risk it, we would never go out the front door, because we take a risk when we walk across the crosswalk, when we drive, when you do anything in your daily life involves risk. But in this domain, there is a zero tolerance of risk, any risk at all, that becomes pathological, and yet at the same time, very much normal in our culture, and almost necessary to stay within the line, these strict confines of what's acceptable.
Right. I just found that really, really fascinating. Before I move to my next question, I'll just remind those who are participating, if they would like to pose a question, do feel free to put that in the Q&A box, okay? Just as a general reminder there. So keeping with the context of risk, there was something else that I found really fascinating. You noted that Paul Slovic created a risk system where catastrophes were at the very top. And there were several other, anything that had to do with children was considered risky. Anything that was considered not natural was risky. And I was wondering, do you see any connection between his list and, say, our increased awareness of risk to our children and the growing phenomena of what we would call helicopter parenting or bulldozer parenting, and then their issues, the children or the adult children's issue of having difficulty, which what's now become a trendy term, adulting?
Yeah. I mean, that's a great question. I think that to go back to Slovic's research, what I found most fascinating about that is that people are really bad at judging risk, right? So people think they're really good at it, and people think, okay, I can make a fair assessment of how big of a risk this actually is. But people over and over again really overestimate the risks of very scary things like SIDS in the context of pregnancy. And they dramatically underestimate the risk of things like cancer or auto accidents or diabetes, the things that are most likely to have catastrophic outcomes in their lives, right? And this was true for almost all people. And then when you layer on top of that, that risks are really, our estimates of risks are deeply influenced by emotion. So in areas that we feel more emotional, right, we are likely to estimate that the risk is much higher. So obviously you put this in the domain of parenting, what is more emotional than giving birth to a child and feeling like, oh my gosh, for the first time, my heart is here in my hands and I'm so vulnerable. People's assessments of risk are bound to be off the charts, right? Which is why it's a fairly common phenomenon, talking to pediatricians and doctors in the research for the book, for women to sort of give up their whole lives in the first months of a newborn's life to prevent SIDS, which, the risk of SIDS for an average newborn is infinitesimal. It's less than 0.001%. It is incredibly tragic outcome, but it's very rare. But women asked to, you know, rate the risk of that, rate it quite high, right? Because it has this real emotional charge to it. And so I think that, and that is sort of cemented during pregnancy and postpartum. So one of the other fascinating things that I read when I was reading studies about sort of the bioethics of risk was that during pregnancy, doctors tend to associate any uncertainty with risk, right? So going back to what you were saying at the beginning. So if anything is uncertain at all, it's risky. Well, obviously everything about a child's life, about a person's life is uncertain to some degree, right? But women are internalizing this notion that they can't tolerate any uncertainty at all, that they need to spend hours on Google researching everything, that everything has to be just right, that they're responsible for the organic produce and the right preschool and all of this stuff. And if they do any of it wrong, there could be a catastrophic outcome and it's their fault, right? So that logic gets cemented early on. And then it's very hard to shed that and work against that later. And there was, you know, another piece that I read in this domain that sort of described contemporary parenting where parents are basically acting as like risk managers for their children, right? And even going back to Adrienne Rich, to her work on motherhood, which is from the 1970s. You know, I read that and I was like, I can't believe this is so relevant now. But she was writing about how women used to have power as mothers, and now our main power is in prevention. And I thought that was so powerful because it speaks to this notion that we're just trying to prevent anything bad from happening all the time. And that's a really sort of sad and limited and also debilitating role to play all the time in a person's life.
Well, and it seems just to sort of carry on with that is that cementedness that you talk about. It seems to carry on into the children and it carries on into the parents. And I think that might be some of what I see as a faculty member in college students.
Mm-hmm.
And they're in the helicopter parenting and in students who are 18, 19, 20-year-olds that are almost afraid to do something without asking their parents, and their parents wanting to know almost every breath that they're going to take.
Right. Right. Yeah. I don't know much about the college domain yet, working my way there. But I mean, yeah, that hyper management is sort of characteristic of this way of parenting, or this philosophy of parenting as sort of constant risk management.
Well, to your next book.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, when I was reading about the people that you interviewed, the one part of the book where I really felt what I would describe as almost fury was where I was reading about how Samantha was treated.
Mm-hmm.
And I was really furious at the nurses who first treated her, then at the doctor, then at that particular hospital, then at the woman physician who seemed to threaten her once she was transported to the next place, to the next institution. I guess it was a psychiatric hospital, the second place where she ended up. Was that correct?
Right. She was institutionalized there against her will.
So I guess as I read on, I could tell that she seemed to make it through that experience. But my question was, do you have contact with any of these women, and do you have contact with her specifically? And if so, how is she doing now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do, and I will tell her that that you asked that because yes, she's actually getting her master's in counseling now after that experience. So for those of you who aren't familiar with that part of the book, without giving too much away, you know, the basis of that story. So the whole book is 7 women's stories, and then woven in between that is this research and this background on all these different aspects of motherhood. So in Samantha's story, she goes to her OB having some intrusive thoughts, which she doesn't know are intrusive thoughts at that time, right? She's having thoughts like, I want to suffocate my baby, right? But able to see that that's a crazy thought that she's having in this moment of desperation that scares her. So she goes in thinking, I'm going to get a prescription for Zoloft or something like that. And instead she's put in an ambulance and she's taken to the ER, and this whole ordeal unfolds. It's pretty unbelievable. And ultimately she's institutionalized in a psychiatric ward in very small town, Ohio, where the main problem is addiction. There's sort of no experience with maternal mental health. So it ends up being a real catastrophe for her. She's nursing her daughter. She can't nurse. So the whole thing is just awful on all these different levels. But it speaks to, again, this extremely narrow definition that we have about motherhood that sort of pathologizes any negative feeling, right? So I think most of the women I've talked to, and again, I tend to be talking to women who are very open about their experiences, will tell me about these times when they've hated their child, when they've screamed, when they've had these explosions or these horrible thoughts or whatnot. But this isn't a part of parenting that we tend to talk about, right? This tends to remain very much hidden. And so there's this notion that you either become a mother and you're sort of normal and happy and you make this transition and everything's fine, or you have some sort of disorder and you have to go get it treated and then you'll be okay. Whereas actually a lot of mothers are somewhere in the middle there of that spectrum. And Samantha is an example of what can happen when we have this view of like either you're a totally normal, great mother, or you're some sort of monster, right? And so, happily, she came out of that experience. She ended up having another baby, and that experience of having the next baby was really empowering for her. She really stood up for herself in her care. And she has gone back, like I said, now to work with other women, which is true of many of the women in the book who were really impacted by their experiences and whose lives really changed when they started talking to other women about their stories. So that's definitely the case with her. She didn't realize, I think what's also really crazy about her story is that she didn't realize how wrong it was, what had happened to her, until she came to this support group of other women. And she had been told so many times, well, the doctors did the right thing because, again, you might have been a risk to your child, even though she knew from her own experience that she needed help, but she didn't need it to be separated from her daughter, which is borne out medically, right? That many women have these intrusive thoughts. And the definition of intrusive thoughts is that you're able to recognize them as deeply problematic. When you can't recognize the thoughts as problematic is when things are worrisome, right? So anyway, she had been told over and over, oh, well, the doctors all did the right thing. And then she got to the support group, she told her story, and there was this sort of unanimous reaction of, that's so messed up. Like how could, and that was so cathartic for her of like, oh, wow, I really did experience something crazy here and traumatic here. And that started her healing process.
Right. Well, that was really captivating. You know what, Sarah, we have a question that just came in from one of the participants. Yeah. And what I'll do, I think it might be good to maybe intermingle that with maybe a couple other questions that I have right now. Yeah. So it says, here's the question. It says, I am in the process of a neurological evaluation for my teenage son to determine if he has ADD, ADHD. Several questions on the parent assessment inquire about my behaviors as a pregnant mother. The amount of coffee I drank during pregnancy is questioned. However, there are no questions about whether, for example, we used Tefal cookware with nonstick cooking. There is ample evidence that DuPont's product is far more dangerous than caffeine. What do you recommend for responding to the medical community that continually points a finger, though rarely directly, at a mother's behavior?
Yes, so that is an incredibly, great question and a really, really profound problem, right? So there's a long history of blaming mothers for everything from autism to schizophrenia to, all sorts of disorders throughout all of history, right? The mother has been the main source of blame for all of these. So for example, after World War II, there was a sort of epidemic of mental illness among men who had just seen incredibly gruesome and traumatic things on the battlefield, right? However, the blame was not on that experience of war. It was on mothers for having coddled their sons too much and made them too sort of, too soft for war, right? So this is a long history in our country. And I think that when you point to something like the Teflon, right, this is part of what's so difficult about risk, because there are real risks out there, right? And particularly in things like chemicals, and particularly in the US, because our government frequently fails to properly regulate these kinds of things, especially for women of color, especially in marginalized neighborhoods. So women are left to do this work themselves, right? Women are suddenly responsible now for buying the organic produce because this pesticide has been approved by an administration and it's shown to cause neurological damage, right? Or because a corporation has covered up all of these toxic effects for years. Women are somehow expected to individually do the work of figuring all of that out on their own, when this should be a corporate and a governmental and a societal responsibility. And that's something we really fail at. Especially for our children as a country. And so it's much easier and, much more familiar for it to instead point the finger at the mother and say, well, what did you do, during this time? Or, well, there must be some direct correlation between your behavior and what's happened to your child. So I think that's tragically, that happens to many women in all sorts of degrees, right? My friend just wrote a beautiful memoir, called Raising a Rare Girl, and her daughter was born with a chromosomal abnormality, and she was asked over and over again, well, what did you do? Did you do drugs? What did you do when you were pregnant? So this sort of assumption that it must somehow fall back on the mother. And also that we as a society aren't all responsible for mothers, right? We don't have all a responsibility for regulating these kinds of things and for the raising of healthy children.
Mm-hmm. And that sort of goes back to, at least in my way of understanding or thinking, to the mother sinned. She did something to help cause.
Right. Right. It becomes this sort of religious notion that if you didn't adhere to the most extreme model of risk prevention, then you sort of brought this like monster upon yourself, right? It's a very antiquated way of thinking, but it persists in the guise of modern medicine.
Right. I think there's another question that nicely fits into the context somewhat. And the next question is, please discuss the risk assessment process via the anti-vax movement.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, that's a charged one. I think,
All right.
yeah, especially now. I think that for me, when I talk about the way that I assess risk now, right, I do look at the scientific evidence. And so what I have found, for example, is I was told over and over and over again when I was pregnant and when my daughter was very young that co-sleeping was extremely dangerous. And I sort of had this instinct at the time, this is a practice that's taken place around the world for a long time. I'm a breastfeeding mother. I'm not drinking. I'm not doing drugs. Like, how dangerous is this? And I did my own research, but this is, again, quality scientific studies published in scientific journals. And I found that co-sleep, deaths during co-sleeping are extremely rare, that over half of them are from premature infants or severely premature infants, and that a lot of them are in these sort of sleeping situations where someone has been smoking or drinking, or the baby's taken out of a bed and taken onto a couch or put in a car seat or whatnot. So I give this example because looking at the evidence myself, I could see that the risk was actually in the 0.001% range. And for me, that was crazy to not sleep with my daughter for that when I could prepare the bed how I wanted to, when it really, impacted my quality of life. When it comes to vaccines, I think if you look at the scientific evidence, there is an extremely robust body of scientific evidence that shows that the risk from vaccines is extremely negligible, and that a lot of the studies that have been, or the main study was Andrew Wakefield's study on autism, has been discredited in all sorts of different ways, right? So if you're looking at the scientific evidence there, now again, this isn't blogs, this isn't, that kind of information. I think that it's fair to draw the conclusion that the risk is extremely small and the benefits not only for one's own child, but for the community are large. So in that sense, I think we have to pay attention there. I think you know, I recommended earlier Eula Biss's book on this subject on immunity, which I think is a beautiful, compassionate, very even-keeled, empathetic exploration of why we fear vaccines. And she looks at, we have legitimate fears of chemicals, right? And we should, because as I spoke to earlier, our society is not very good at regulating these things. But she also marshals all sorts of evidence to show how, you know, not only are vaccines safe and necessary, but why we have these sort of deep-seated fears about them and how we might confront those fears. So I think that's an example of where we need to look at what emotionally is happening with us and what particular fear we have associated with that, and whether or not that's actually borne out, you know, scientifically. So I know for myself, I had a real fear of lead poisoning, right? This is a legitimate fear. You know, there are children obviously affected by this all over the US, but my fear had gotten so out of control that I was sort of not letting my daughter touch anything or put anything in her mouth. So that's where you really need to be able, maybe even to get some professional help to rein that back and be able to put it in perspective. Because I think it is, particularly for those fears around chemicals or contamination, it is easy for the emotional fear of that to sort of cloud the reality around it. I hope that answers that question.
I hope it does too. So I think, once again, just to remind people, if they would like to ask any more questions, please feel free to type it into the Q&A box. And while maybe we wait for some more questions, I have another one, and I think that it segues on to what you were just talking about, because you were alluding to some of your own, or you were encouraging people, if they get to that point, that they need to seek help. So I wondered if you could say a little bit about the time your therapist told you that you had to accept that your daughter would face danger in her life. And I'm wondering, there were several times when he said something, I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but it was something to the effect as, Sarah, she will have to face danger. She will be in dangerous situations, and you're going to have to accept that. So I was wondering, what kind of impact did that have on you then and now? Because that was a few years ago, right?
Yes. And, you know, I think what's really funny is to put that moment in context, because that's exactly what he said. And that did impact me in all these powerful ways. And so one would think, listening to that comment, one would think that I was doing something with my child, like dangling her outside of a 4th-story window or something. What I was actually doing was giving her a gummy bear that had fallen on the floor, right? So this is how sort of like far out I had gotten, where I was like, oh my God, she can't eat that. And this happened in my therapist's office, and my daughter came with me for a few sessions, and I sort of had this panicked reaction of like, she can't put that in her mouth. And that was when the therapist said that, right? Which just goes to show you how deep into this it's you know, possible to get, where even a gummy bear that's got some like, you know, fuzz on it is unacceptable, right? But that moment, you know, and I let her eat the gummy bear, and it was painful at the time to let her eat the gummy bear. It was physically painful to do that and to say, oh my God, what does it have on it? Again, could it have dust and these toxins on it? But, you know, I did what's called exposure therapy, and very much it's about literally having to sit there and sort of stomach your fears. And I mean, this is not actually dangerous things, but things that sort of trigger your worst fears, right? And being able to sit with that. And so when he explained it like that, you know, basically what he was saying is, you know, the world is mildly dangerous, right? He would say to me, you get in your car and you drive down here and you trust that you're not going to be killed by a speeding car that's coming the other way, right? You just take that for granted. Like, that's the world that we live in, you know? And so you have to accept that we live in that world. And I think what people with OCD do and what people with anxiety do is they try and control every single aspect of their lives and their children's lives with the notion that, like, if they get everything right, it'll be okay, right? And I think what I had to learn, and I think this is a really profound lesson for anyone, parents or no, is that we are all vulnerable all the time, and we all live with uncertainty all the time. And if we're constantly trying to have control, really all we have is anxiety, right? It's a wonderful Elizabeth Gilbert quote that I like is, you know, you thought you had control, but all you ever had was anxiety. And that's a sort of variation on what my therapist said to me, was that, you know, you're going to have to be able to live a meaningful life. You're going to have to be able to tolerate some of that uncertainty and tolerate that bad things do happen in the world. So one of the things that he taught me to say that I tell other women now, because I found it so helpful, was bad things might happen, but I have to live my life. Right. So this is decisions about things like going to Mexico or taking a taxi that we would have to take in Mexico, where, you know, and I think for each woman, the calculation here is going to be different about what matters to her. But for me, I was so limited in what I could do that I had to use that refrain of like, okay, something bad might happen, but I'm going to do this because I want to live my life and I want my daughter to live a full life. So learning to sort of speak back to that urge.
Did that almost become like a mantra to you to repeat that phrase over? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I remember we flew down to Mexico. I mean, we go regularly. It was one of the times we were going down. My daughter was, somewhere around 1. And, you know, to get to Oaxaca, you have to take a flight from Pittsburgh to Houston, and then Houston to Mexico City, and then a teeny tiny little plane from Mexico City to Oaxaca. And I'm not a fan of flying, which is not surprising for someone with anxiety, but especially this little plane, you're going over the mountains, it's always like, and I just said that to myself over and over again, okay, well, bad thing, plane might crash, but I got to do this because I want my daughter to live this life. Like I want her to know what it is to land in this country late at night and go out for tacos. And I want her to experience that,
Super. Well, I just see that another question has come in, and I think it also connects with what we've been talking about. And the question is, I feel like parenting can be a shame-minded, can be a shame minefield. Can you discuss shame in and around motherhood and the best way, the best way to keep thoughts, feelings of shame in perspective and at bay?
Wow. Yes. So again, to just preface that I'm not a professional in this field. So, so I'm not sure I have like the ultimate solution, but my suggestion would be, that like I can speak to my own experiences of shame. And I think I didn't realize how deep my shame was about what I was going through until I met with the woman in the book. She's the first story in the book. Her name is April. And she was the first person who had ever talked so frankly about what she went through as a mother. And she had extreme OCD, right? And she looked like this very normal, very together, educated woman, right? And I remember having this sort of cognitive dissonance where I thought, well, she looks so like educated and normal and together. And then I was like, wait a minute, I hope I look that way. And I've got the exact same thing, right? And she was so open about her experience. And she said, I put all the knives in the basement. I wouldn't let any plastic bag come in the house. And there was a part of me that was saying, oh, wow, that sounds crazy. And then there was another part of me that was saying, oh my God, I do the exact same things. And I realized that I had been way too ashamed up to that point to sort of speak to those as being a disorder, as evidence of an illness. So there was something incredibly cathartic about saying to her, yes, I do the exact same thing, and here's how it works for me, and talking frankly about that for the first time. So I think that just giving voice to that, and even, the therapist that I saw, right, and the therapist that actually this woman April saw, both of their recommendations were to write this sort of shameful or scary thoughts down, right, or to say them to someone else. And I think when you get them out of that dark interior place, they lose a little bit of that power, right? A lot of that power is internalizing and trying to justify to yourself and trying to work that all out on your own. And so just speaking with someone who will listen to you, and someone who's going to be empathetic and maybe who has had a similar experience, I think can be really powerful for alleviating some of that shame, right? Finding that camaraderie with other women. Because I do think, sadly, because there is so much fear and so much blame around motherhood, right? Some people turn to this sort of shaming to sort of project that away from themselves.
Mm-hmm. Well, switching gears just a little bit, you quote Roshi Joan Halifax, and who, by the way, Roshi ordained me as a hospice chaplain a couple years ago.
Wow, congratulations, that's great.
I know Roshi advocates sitting meditation for alleviating the suffering of your own and of the suffering that you so eloquently described by the people that you interviewed. I was wondering, do you have a meditative practice? Was that encouraged by any of your therapists, by any of the physicians or the medical professionals? Because it seems that if you have, it seems that the contemplative research would suggest that that could be one of the ways that might alleviate the suffering and the anxiety, because Roshi would say, I think, that anxiety, that the fear that you describe is a form of suffering.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. And that is a great question. No one recommended this to me, which I think is shocking because I have done research on this myself, again, sort of in my own, my own research that I tend to do. And I found that mindfulness-based stress relief programs, so these are sort of intensive meditation programs that go over several months, can dramatically reduce these symptoms for women. So anxiety and OCD symptoms. I haven't done one myself. Now that's a little bit off limits. There might be online versions, but I've, okay, great. Yeah. So I've heard that can be really successful. And I think it's really unfortunate that there isn't more attention being paid to that, because there really is quite a bit of evidence that meditation can change your neurocircuitry in all sorts of ways. I do have an erratic, burgeoning meditation practice. So I've been trying to do this for about a year of doing 5 minutes a day, 2 to 5 minutes a day, usually after I do some yoga. And I will say I veer off from it regularly and then I come back. It's shockingly hard to do, even for 5 minutes, for someone who's very sort of type A and go and productive. But even those 5 minutes are incredibly powerful, because I think what's so good about meditation for anxiety is that, anxiety is about acting on these thoughts all the time. You have these thoughts, and each thought is like an, oh my God, what if thought? And then, it's sort of like, okay, we'll have to go figure out how to make it okay, how to control it and whatnot. And it becomes intolerable to sit with those thoughts of the uncertainty. And meditation really forces you to just hear all the crazy stuff that's going on in your brain and just sit with it and not do anything and sort of ride that out. And that's a really critical skill. And again, I have not been as disciplined as I would like to be, but that is number one on my list of regular things to do to sort of keep things at bay. And I do think, I hope that we will see a lot more research and a lot more therapeutic movement in that direction, because there is so much to demonstrate the effects of meditation on the brain and on these disorders.
I hope so too. There is a top neuroscientist who is also a serious meditator. His name is Richie Davidson. Uh-huh. And one of the things that Richie says, and I remember that there was a point in the book where you had said that some of the techniques that people were using to address their depression and their anxiety was cognitive behavior therapy. And Richie Davidson says that the process of engaging in cognitive behavior therapy is indeed a meditative practice, because what you do is you catch your mind, you catch the thought and remind yourself that it's just the thought. But just based on what you said, I think that you would enjoy that a lot.
Right. Well, because so much of that is about paying attention, right? So you learn to just pay attention to all these patterns that you get into all the time. And like you said, to catch yourself before you sort of fall into the groove of that again. Exactly. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, I see that we have another question. It's, how did the process of researching and writing this book impact you on a personal level? That's a great question.
Yeah, that is a great question. So, I mean, it was incredibly transformative for me personally, because I think I had started from this point of knowing my own experience and of really wanting to understand more of my own experience. Like, how did I come to suffer so much from this without really ever recognizing it as a disorder, or without really without putting it in any sort of larger context. And so when I started to do this research and when I started to talk to other women, I found it so cathartic and so powerful to hear their stories and to realize that, sadly, this is ubiquitous, it's everywhere. And there are all of these, things, to sort of what I call the dark side of motherhood, these difficult things that are so buried still and so hidden in our society. So excavating those was this really powerful process for me. And not only in connecting with other women, but also in just being able to, again, sort of pay attention to my own experience in all these different contexts and like give voice to what I'd been through. So in something like risk, where I had experienced this in medical contexts all the time, but I didn't have like a real framework for understanding it. So, the book was born out of my desire to say, what is actually happening here? And that was really powerful for me to be able to say, okay, I understand where this is coming from now, and I can sort of speak up to it and recognize it. And I also think, I have this sort of interesting trajectory where I had been writing a lot about travel in my 20s. I lived mostly overseas, and I was sort of doing more like adventure writing. And then my first book ended up being an essay collection about motherhood, which came out of left field, and I did not expect at all. And so I think I sort of started on this trajectory then of writing a lot more about women. And that is somewhat, I wouldn't say controversial, but that has implications, right? And I've seen that writing about motherhood, the way that it can be treated in the literary world or in the larger culture. So I think this book was another opportunity for me to say, I'm really going to own this subject. Like, I'm not going to be ashamed to write about motherhood. I think it's something that is integral to all of our lives and that so many women experience, and we should make visible, and it should be art, and we should all be able to appreciate it. So I really fully embrace that with this book, and embrace sort of writing about women's lives in particular.
I think that's great. And I think that I can imagine how so many people have read your book or who will read your book and be able to say, wow, I can really relate to this. I'm not the only one who feels like this. It's neat. Or I can imagine someone saying, there's comfort in knowing that my feelings are not isolated feelings, that someone else has had similar ones and made it through the fruitful darkness, as you so eloquently described.
Yes, I hope so.
Well, as we wait for another question, let me see if you would be willing to talk a little bit about, especially in the context of what's happening right now in the United States, a little bit about your understanding and what you've learned about the racial inequality of medical attention, of the way women of color or people of color are treated. I think that you have some really exquisite research that you've done around this.
Thank you. Yeah, I think this was incredibly shocking for me, and humbling how little I knew of this. I had a moment when I was researching these sections and writing these sections when I said to Jorge, I know so much more about Mexican culture and Mexican history and Latino culture than I do about Black Americans. And there's something really strange and messed up about that. I mean, I'm very glad that I know what I do about Mexico, but how is it that as an American born and raised here, educated here through college, I had no idea about some of the most fundamental aspects of African American history. And so, for the book, I read more widely in that history, and it was truly stunning. And I think many white Americans are coming to that realization now. And so, so just to immerse myself in that world and realize that, like, I had to do this at age 36, for myself, that's crazy. And then what I realized in the research, that I think would probably also be shocking for most white Americans, is that racism is a physical phenomenon. It's an embodied phenomenon, right? So I think as a white person, this is part of white privilege, we tend to think about racism as this sort of like abstract, intangible thing that's like political or that we talk about in, that's related to words or concepts. And what I found in this research was that racism is really born physically by those who experience the brunt of it. And most, the brunt of the racism in this country is born mostly by Black women. And that really shows in their pregnancy outcomes. And so study after study after study, and you're not talking about one small esoteric study, but I mean, again and again and again and again, studies would show that more than any other factor, so you're talking about education, financial status, living conditions, whether someone is single or married, more than anything else, perceived racism had the biggest effect on low birth weight for Black women. And Black women are far more likely to have preterm births and low birth weight than white women. So that was stunning to me, just that fact in and of itself, that these studies had shown across all sorts of dimensions that racism has a real impact on Black women's bodies. And one of the other most surprising things that I learned was that for white women, as they get a college education and as they earn more money, their infant mortality rate drops by half, right? So white women who have less than a college education, their infant mortality rate is 15 in 10,000. I think I should check these. It's somewhere in that range of like 15 in 1,000 or 15 in 10,000, right? When they get a doctorate and when their financial situation improves, that rate drops in half, right? For Black women, it's the inverse. So Black women who are, with a high school education, right, have an infant mortality rate that's the same as white women. But when they get the doctorate or when they get, they have an improved financial status, their infant mortality rate actually doubles. And that has been attributed to all of the stress of having to navigate predominantly white environments. So that's just a stunning statistic that I think speaks to the way racism is sort of a toxin polluting the water everywhere, right? And it has real physical impacts on Black women and children in particular.
Well, I think maybe there's time for one more question that I have anyway. I don't see any more in the Q&A box, but what might be some of the advice, say maybe 1, 2, maybe 3 pieces of advice you would give to a woman who is beginning to experience some of the things that you have experienced when you were noticing that things were really going haywire, for lack of a better term? What might be 2 or 3 things you might suggest that they do that could help them?
Yes, definitely. So
your whole book really does that. But.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I mean, I think one really important thing to do is just to speak up about it right away. And to, and if you are feeling like it is debilitating in your life, it probably is. And even if, I think so many women in the book were told over and over again, oh, you're just a good mom, or it's normal, right? It shouldn't be normal, even if it is. Right. So if it's impacting your life and you're starting to feel it's a problem, then it is. And then you really need to find someone to speak to about that. And I feel like saying find help can be really problematic because sometimes the help actually really isn't helpful. But start reaching out and avoid the tendency to sort of say, oh, well, I'm just an extra good mom, or I'm just extra vigilant or whatnot. And then, I think the counterintuitive advice that I really wish that I would have gotten was that when, if you find yourself starting to get into this cycle of risk prevention where it starts to become increasingly intolerant to have any sort of risk at all, and you're spending hours on Google and you're feeling the need to control everything in the house at all times, to sit with the uncertainty of that, like we were talking about. So, for example, one woman in the book had to just not check her son's breathing for 10 seconds, right? I mean, that was intolerable for her. But those things, what are the things that are really challenging for you? And how can you sit with the uncertainty of that? Now, again, this isn't like letting children climb out of windows or whatnot, but for most women who are dealing with this, that's not what's happening. These are people who are hyper concerned with sort of going to the ultimate extreme of controlling everything. So instead of that normalizing view of, oh, you're just being ultra safe, sort of trying to take the other view of like, how can I be able to sit with this fear that I have and not act on it right now?
One of the things that Roshi Jonah Halifax talks about I'm not sure if she mentions it in her book, The Fruitful Darkness, but she certainly talks about it in any of the training that she does at the Upaya Zen Center. And that is the importance of living in the not knowing, of living with the uncertainty. And when I was going through my chaplaincy training program, that was one of the hardest things, because I think we as human beings, we want certainty. We so want things to be predictable and certain. And the hard, cold fact is there's not very much that's certain.
No, and I think this is something that we are, so I think, one of the things that I say in the book is that for many women, having a baby is their first real experience of grief, right? And it's not a conventional way that we think about motherhood. We think about motherhood as just sort of this happy transition and la la la, now you've achieved the ultimate, in having a baby. But motherhood can also be this really profound experience of grief on all sorts of levels. It involves all sorts of losses, even with a healthy, wonderful, normal pregnancy. And I think part of that grief is really the awareness of death for the first time. And I know in my experience, that was one of the most profound takeaways from having my daughter was, now I sense my own mortality in this entirely new way. And it's almost unbearable, right? I mean, I had taken all sorts of risks in my 20s, done all sorts of crazy things. I'd been married for a long time by the time I had my daughter. And this was the first time I felt that pang of, oh my God, I can't control anything. And what if the worst possible thing happens, and how would I ever survive that? And I think a lot of women respond to that like I did, by going into overdrive time to just shut it down all the time. And that's a really debilitating way to live, and ultimately a really limited way to live. So to speak to my friend's memoir quickly about her daughter who had the chromosomal syndrome, one of the most powerful things that she writes about there is how she's had to live with uncertainty from day one, right? Her daughter might die of a seizure. Her daughter, they don't know her daughter's life expectancy. So she has had to internalize and live with this vulnerability that so many other parents spend their lives trying to repress. So I think that can be a really powerful lesson of parenthood if we let it be.
Super, super. Well, Sarah, I see that it's almost 8:05, and I so appreciate the conversation that we've had. It's just an excellent read. I encourage all of my friends to read it, whether they're parents or not, because if nothing else, it's so well written. And if you like memoir, I think you would like it as well. So I think with that, I'd like to turn it back to Linda. And Sarah, just know, I wish you the very, very best. It was great to meet you.
Oh, well, thank you so much. It was wonderful chatting with you. It was a great question.
Thank you, both of you. Thank you for your wonderful questions, Janette. And what a fascinating conversation. I encourage all of you in the audience to tell your friends about Ordinary Insanity. Such an insightful book. For those of you who haven't yet had a chance to read Sarah's groundbreaking book, I know you'll want to now. This has been an incredible and illuminating conversation. And I'm actually curious about what Sarah's next book is going to be. Thank you both for being with us tonight.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.